Hello, everybody. So, Bet O'Rourke says he is descended from slave owners, supports reparations to unite two Americas. And so I was looking at that amongst all of the other things that have been going on and developing in the current time of what we're dealing with in terms of racism. Um, Democratic presidential hopeful Bet O'Rourke revealed on Sunday that he and his wife are descended from slave owners, according to documents that he said he received recently. So, the former House representative of El Paso, Texas, published a Medium blog post named after two slaves, Rose and Eliza, who he says his ancestors left to others in their will. Okay, so something that we've been thinking about and talking about in town hall meetings and out on the campaign trail, of course. So the legacy of slavery in the U.S. now has much more personal connection to that O'Rourke wrote, noting that his wife Amy also had ancestors who owned slaves. And I'm going to add in there these two people, they're acknowledging and they're admitting and they're owning up to the facts that there's a certain types of responsibility to be honest about who they're descended from. And much of America has not done that. And so this is just but two of many, probably many hundreds of people who have benefited from the system of systemic racism in the US. And so the revelation came shortly after NBC News published findings from the US Census records saying that Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, a longtime opponent of government reparations for slavery, is himself descended from slave owners. And so you recently, if you weren't really looking at this, but Senator Mitch McConnell, he actually said that the original sin has already been forgiven because they elected Obama and that they had the Civil War, and he used those as excuses to pretty much write off the fact of recognizing that reparations is a much needed topic, not only a much needed topic that needs to be examined and taken serious, but also looked at in ways of how to distribute some forms of payment and compensation to people who are also here in the US, even though we were not directly people who were slaves. We are descendants of slaves, DOS, as people are descendants of slave owners are benefiting. They're benefiting from a system that has enslaved people from the past. But the people who are not benefiting anything and not compensated outside of all of the other groups that have been compensated, like Jewish people that have been compensated, Jewish people who went through a period that was called the Holocaust, the Jewish Holocaust survivors and what have you, and then their wealth is then transferred down to their children and then their grandchildren. You know, it's a generational wealth that is handed down. It's the same ideology. When you have slave owners, they hand that wealth down. They don't just sit on it and just build on it and then die and then leave it sitting there. They send that wealth on down to their children, their children's children, their great grandchildren, and so on and so forth. And so that is where you get the Mitch McConnells and the Beto O'Rourke, people like that. And only some people will acknowledge that they have benefited from that system and How have Black people who are descendants of slaves had any compensation or benefited? None, none whatsoever. The only thing that Black people have dealt with is more poverty, more discrimination. And speaking of discrimination, as you've seen those tweet storms from Donald Trump with the female people who are in politics that were extremely racist that just happened recently. And so that's the ways that we have benefited in a negative sense. We have not benefited in a positive sense. We've benefited negatively. Others have benefited positively and they've been able to keep that wealth and pass it down to their children and so forth. As in people of color, we have not benefited at all whatsoever. It is a negative benefit in terms of not benefiting nothing, zero, only more discrimination, a legacy of trauma, a legacy of systematic discrimination that carries throughout. And so I'm adding that in there. So that's what has happened. And so that's what Beto O'Rourke is saying in this article that is put out, is that he acknowledges the fact that even though this is a new generation of people and it's a new era, it's the same politics, it's the same people that are controlling. They have passed all of that legacy down. They are still benefiting from that system, and you have to hold yourself accountable for what you're benefiting from. So that's what he's saying. So reparations is something that needs to be supported. And so the revelation came shortly after getting back, digressing, after NBC News published findings from the U.S. record saying that Senator Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, a longtime opponent government reparations, he opposed reparations for slavery, is himself descended from slave owners. And so the Kentucky representative, a Republican, has since doubled down on his opposition to reparations, arguing, this is his Mitch McConnell's argument for those of you that did not hear it or you're just coming into this. He argued that no one who is currently living is responsible for what he called America's original sin, that of which being slavery. Alabama fever. These are related articles. This is about Mitch McConnell. Right now, his boyhood town, where his family owned slaves, the reparation debate thrives out there. So I don't think this is Mitch McConnell out of his words, his mouth quoted here in the article. I don't think reparations for something that happened 150 years ago, for whom none of us currently living are responsible, is a good idea. So McConnell told reporters last month, we've tried to deal with our original sin of slavery by fighting a civil war, by passing a landmark civil rights legislation, and we elected an African American president, and that being Obama. And so Mitch McConnell's remarks provided, or it proved, controversial as critics said. They reflected that the politician's racial blind spots. Okay, so Mitch McConnell, we paid for our sin of slavery by electing Obama. So for those of you that are just coming in on this, that is the argument of people in this group that believe that they're benefiting from a system of slavery and ongoing wealth that has passed on through in their legacy from the backs of slaves. They feel that they don't owe anything because they elected Obama and they let him get in there. With all of the presidents that we've had, they figured Obama's good enough. And McConnell benefited like many others, like any other individual, family, or a country that would benefit, okay, through an accumulation of generational wealth and privilege directly tied to the bestial submersion of other human beings into a system of long-term free labor and breeding. So Ricky L. Jones, chair of the Pan-African Studies Department at the University of Louisville told Louisville Courier Journal of the USA Today Network. The benefits are far-reaching and innumerable, Jones said. So faced with similar findings, Beto O'Rourke views his family history in a different light. Okay, so using his ancestry to instead argue in support of reparations. And so he acknowledges it. He is holding himself accountable, as is there's probably some others that are honest in holding themselves accountable and think this is something that is long debated and overdue and should be enacted as let's look into how we can fix things or we can start to fix things. Not just talk about it, we've talked about it long enough, or we've thrown it aside or not taken it serious. But let's look into this because this is how they connect to it because they realize that they have benefited from this system. So they, as in people who are descendants of slave owners. And so they were able to build wealth on the backs and the sweat of others, wealth that they have accumulated that would be able to be passed down to their children and their children and children's children's grandchildren, and so forth. So O'Rourke said of two of his great 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 grandfathers. And so he acknowledges that. And so the way that fortune was passed through generations from Andrew to me, misfortune was passed through the generations from Rose and Eliza to their descendants who are alive today, which would be any one of us that have had someone, any Black person that has in America has had someone that has fell victim to this system. You are on the opposing benefit side where your legacy is poverty and discrimination and whatsoever. So even though you weren't back in that time, you are a product of that. And somehow, even the ones that figured, oh, we'll pull up our bootstraps, go to college, work hard, and all of this, and you even have some Black people that are not even in support of this. They say, oh, we can make our own money, we can build our own wealth, we can do this and do that. Well, some people are not able to do that as easy and readily. Okay, and so you still somehow get discriminated in one shape, form, or another. So the way fortune was passed through the generations from Andrew to me, misfortune. Misfortune was passed through the generations to Rose and Eliza and their descendants, of whom today are alive, O'Rourke wrote. So he went on to outline examples of existing inequalities between Black America and white America, including disparities in wealth, rates of incarceration, infant mortality, asserting that there really are two Americas. And so increase that only increases the urgency I feel to help change this country so that it works for those whom have been locked out or locked up in this system, O'Rourke wrote. Several other Democratic challengers have also expressed public support for reparations, including Senator Kamala Harris of California, Cory Booker, New Jersey, and Julian Castro. So we all need to know our history as it relates to the national story, much as I learned mine, that O'Rourke concluded. So it is only then that I believe that we can take the necessary steps to repair the damage done and stop visiting this injustice on the generations that follow ours. So it's an ongoing generational cycle that happens when you benefit from a system that has propped you up and your family with generational wealth, and then another group has not benefited but benefited only with a legacy of poverty, misfortune, discrimination of some shape, form, or fashion. Even the people who just a few may have made it through some of the cracks, somewhere along the line they have family members that have been locked up for things that they hadn't done, or they've been locked out of a system that has set it up so that they could fail in terms of the housing market, or they have not benefited from the wealth hasn't trickled down through everyone as it has in white families. And that is the fact That is a fact that has happened throughout many generations. And even when you want to look at people and say, well, not all white people are wealthy, well, guess what? Not all white people are having to deal with what most black people have to deal with in this country. So that is the fact, the matter of the fact. And so he is owning up to that. And he realizes that a system that is set up for these two Americas, and one to flourish and the other to fail, it is a self, not only it is a, they want you to look at it as like you're calling this into existence, but it is not just that. It is a factual fulfilling prophecy, not just something that is isolated to oneself and how they carry themselves and how they were reared, but it's how a legacy of trauma and of beastly treatment that has passed through generations, and you're a product of whatever that was. It's the same as when you raise your children, and if you raise your children in a situation where they're always in good schools, and they're eating well and they have good health care, their odds of you know their livelihood are a lot better than those of people who come from a situation where they're not eating well, they don't have health care, and they're not going to good schools. Their schools are not supported because they're in a neighborhood where housing is not really being supported, and it's in a situation of poverty. They're not putting money into that community. They're funneling money out of that community, or money is never even going really into that community. It's struggling. And so you can tell by the neighborhoods, even in Los Angeles, you can tell by pockets and neighborhoods where businesses are struggling to stay open. And it's all over, not just in LA, but it's all over America, where certain neighborhoods, businesses are struggling, schools are struggling, they're underfunded, and then those houses in the area are depreciated because of the fact that no money is being put and invested in those particular communities. It's, even though they're saying there's no more redlining, mentally they're still redlining. Mentally, it's still happening. People live segregated lives, even though segregation was outlawed. People still live segregated lives. And so that's the reason why Beto O'Rourke was saying this. So I believe that he's right 100%, that the same system still goes on and it carries on throughout the generations as a cycle of poverty or a cycle of wealth that is generated from what happened in the past is going to determine what happens in the future. So with that being said, I'm going to let that comment and this video go. And what do you think about that? I really do believe that the same things still are persistent in society today. That's the reason why people suffer the way they do, or they're wondering why they're not able to get into a place. They're kind of stuck there, and they are not able to get opportunities as access to opportunities as readily as their counterparts. Having said that, thanks for listening.